Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Green Dragon Podcast. I'm your host, Aiden.
And your fellow host, Tom.
And your fellow host, Jake.
We're back with another week, another installment of the Foundations of Freedom podcast series. We're excited about this one. This one's been, I think, a while in the making. We've been kind of we had this one in the back of our mind since we finished the Civil War series, because of the importance of the man we're going to talk about tonight. He definitely played a significant impact, not only during his time, but also his legacy is probably one of the most um, widely felt, I think, in American history. If you look back on American history outside of the founding fathers, I think most would agree that Abraham Lincoln is one of the most influential leaders of not only his time but of all time, and his legacy is multifaceted and encompasses several areas, whether it be his uh, movement for the freeing of slaves in America, his leadership and his statesmanship, his promotion of democracy and equality, or his symbol of unity and inspiration in our country. So overall, Lincoln is, I think, a really important leader in American history, and also a big figure in world history. So I'm excited that we get to chat about him tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting topic to look into his life and what he did in his work. Like, one of the episodes that we listened to in preparation for this, the host of that podcast said that Abraham Lincoln is one of those people that have turned a lot of minds towards him because he's such a complex character. It's hard to understand really where he comes from and where he's going in a full comprehensive sense.
Yeah, I think we not a lot is known widely, at least, about his early life before the presidency. I think because his achievements therein were so monumental. So yeah, this was a pretty exciting learning experience for me as well to delve a little deeper into what formed him before his achievements that he's more known for.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I just in doing the research for this podcast, I think that was the thing that stood out to me the most is like you hear about Lincoln, the president, the man who stood up against slavery, the man who kept or unified or kept the United States unified during the Civil War, or fought to keep it unified, and ultimately died for that cause. But you don't hear a lot about who Lincoln was as a person really before that. You hear a little bit about, like, oh, he was born in Kentucky in a log cabin, maybe, or things here and there. But like, there was a lot to Abraham Lincoln's life before he became president, or even before he got into politics. Like, he lived, I mean, what most would consider a pretty interesting life and successful life outside of politics. And I think it's just an example of, like, when you look at the lives of the founding fathers too, like they had exciting lives, and then they felt this, I think, this pull to serve their country, um, through serving on a higher level. And I think he kind of felt that pull at a certain point in his life to, or I said that pull, a sense of duty, for his country to help make a change. So I think it's important to, like, as we're discussing this, we'll cover his early life and his life before politics a lot, because I think it really does give you a picture, or that starts to shape this character in your mind of who he really was and why he was such a great leader.
Absolutely, Aiden. I was really curious to learn about the different things that influenced his life decisions. It seemed like many of them had to do with his love of running. It seemed like he was like the bookworm of Illinois. Like he tried to get everything he could and read it and educate himself on ideas and the implications of those ideas. And then I think when we get into more like his career path, that being a lawyer was a way for him to truly apply his mind and good arguments, well-formed rhetoric, um, articulate speech, and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, really a self-made man too, as we'll see once we get further into his life. I think that's something to keep in mind, though, throughout the discussion of his life, is that he really didn't have a formal education in law, or even just basic high school, or the equivalent of that today. So yeah, definitely was a highly motivated individual.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like as we've done these podcasts and looked at some of our nation's greatest leaders, it seems to be this common theme that there's not always a great formal education. There is sometimes, but there's not always this great formal education, and a lot of the even with the ones that did have a formal education, a lot of their learning, a lot of their professional development came through self-education and and just reading a lot. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind. That Lincoln was no different. Lincoln was a person that loved to study, loved to read, and I think that can be a example for all of us.
Yeah, like it's interesting that when we did the Jefferson podcast on how much time he spent reading, wasn't it like 12 to 15 hours a day or something like that? And he just would think and read and speak, and then I guess speaking wasn't his forte, but Lincoln would like as soon as he got off of work would try to get a book and eat some cornbread and read in a corner, and he loved that. That was like his favorite thing. Um, so yeah, it is really interesting that, like you said, Aiden, the American leaders have all been very self-taught and self-educated, and it seems like the ones that are the poor leaders were the ones that kind of accepted the education system. They weren't really self-taught. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it goes to show you the importance of being invested in your one's learning. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about all this, guys. I think we'll start out with his early life, and that started in 1809 in February 12th, and a lot of us know that if you're of the age where you saw it on the calendar, February 12th, Lincoln's birthday. I know I remembered it because of that. I was like, oh, February 12th, yeah, of course, that's Lincoln's birthday. But not everybody pays attention to that anymore. But Abraham Lincoln was born to Thomas and Nancy Lincoln in Hardin County, Kentucky. So in a little log cabin, and yeah, it's I went there. I visited there when I was a kid, and it's really nothing to speak. I mean, this is when you say log cabin. I mean, this thing's basically just four, you know, It's got four walls and it's got a dirt floor and it's pretty small. It's nothing. It's nothing to it's nothing fancy, that's for sure. Um, so yeah, he was born in Hardin County, and then in 1811 he moved with his family from that original cabin to their farm in just off of Knob Creek, Kentucky. So that's his. I think they call it his boyhood home. We went and visited that too when I was younger as well, in Kentucky. So he was Kentucky born and lived there for a while. And I know Illinois likes to, take a lot of pride in Lincoln, but I think Kentucky. I don't know who deserves. I think Illinois is just kind of swooping in and jumping in and stealing something that they didn't create necessarily. I know he spent a lot of time in Illinois, but he was, I guess, probably a Kentucky boy at heart. So in 1816, so he would have been, that's age of 7. He actually moved to Indiana. So again, Illinois is not in the picture here. So, my great state of Illinois that I came from, they're really trying hard here to take something that they shouldn't be. They're taking too much credit for this. So he goes to Indiana, which, as every Illinois person believes, Indiana's like, I think I've heard it described as America's butt crack, the armpit of America. Um, Nothing good comes out of Indiana, but in this case, Lincoln came out of Indiana, so I guess that's a bright spot in
I
their
think
in their
I
history
think
books.
I think as an Illinois resident, the only reason that we look down on Indiana is that's literally the only state that may be more boring than what we have here. So that's
Exactly.
probably I think we take advantage of that.
I think you're completely right. I think you're definitely right there. I think yeah, yeah. I think we take opportunity to. I think we take every opportunity that we can to find a state that has something worse than we do. But besides the point, his family moved to Indiana in 1816. Um, but shortly thereafter, actually, his mother actually died of milk sickness. Now I don't. I meant to look this up. I even put it in little. I kind of changed the font on it and everything, and kind of I even put it in bold as I was going through in my notes to look up what the heck milk sickness is, but I didn't. Do you guys know what milk sickness is? I feel stupid here.
I saw from the little research I did on it was that this particular case of it, historians believe stemmed from a single cow in Indiana that had fed on a white snake root plant,
Huh.
which I guess contains a kind of poison.
Hmm.
So then from there, the milk that was from that cow that was distributed um, among the population, or I think maybe it was more than one cow. I guess it would have had to have been, but I think it was maybe from one farm. That's probably the correct way to think about it. But then it
Hmm.
spread from there throughout. I think it was southern Indiana that was hit the hardest, and yeah, unfortunately, Lincoln's mother was a victim of that.
That's kind of crazy. You don't really. I mean, like it's crazy to think about some of those things that like really some of the sicknesses or illnesses that pre-modern medicine really took a lot of lives. And yeah, wow, that's pretty wild. Thanks, Jake. I didn't know what it was. um. So yeah, Nancy, his mother died from the milk sickness, and then his father Thomas actually left Abe and his sister Sarah at their Indiana farm, and then Thomas traveled back to Kentucky to find a new wife, which I thought was interesting. Like, I hadn't heard too many stories about like people losing their wife and then like traveling back to their state to find a new wife. Like, I thought that was something interesting that you don't. I mean, you definitely don't see that too often now. It's not like, oh yeah, my wife died. Let me, I'm just gonna leave the kids back in Illinois. We're gonna go back out to like California to find myself a new wife. Like it's pretty, it's pretty interesting. Like I don't know, maybe it was just the thing to do at the time, but I that kind of like struck me as like I don't know, maybe it wasn't that different back then, but it seemed different to me.
Yeah, maybe those Kentucky women are just
Yeah,
that much better.
you can't get them anywhere else. I have a coworker from Kentucky that would agree with me, I think.
Really strong with bourbon.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, there's something in the blood there. Too funny. But yeah, so his father Thomas leaves or left him and his sister Sarah in Indiana and returned back to Kentucky to remarry. Um, and then it took him a year, like in 1819 in December, so almost a little over a year later, Thomas Lincoln remarries, and he marries Sarah Johnston in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. And Sarah went on to have three children of her own, and but her and Abe Lincoln developed a pretty close bond, and I think Sarah was, I think, because of his younger age when his biological mother died. I think that she played a really a big role in his development uh, as a child. So I think maybe a lot of the traits that we associate with Lincoln, we have Sarah to thank for that. So in his between 1819 and 1830, so kind of his childhood, Lincoln goes through like schooling when possible, formal schooling when possible. But most of his time is spent working on the family farm or for neighbors. So it's kind of just you learn if there's time, but the main duty is to the farm and to the family, which is pretty cool. Um, so it wasn't like they shipped him off to school. He was there to help, with chores around the house, chores around the farm, and I think from a young age developed a strong sense of what it meant to be hardworking that he carried over into the rest of his life. Some of those values. Um, Later in his teen years, Lincoln actually worked as a ferryman on the Ohio River, and he would help take flatboat cargo from Indiana to New Orleans. So, in our bourbon podcast, we talked about that trade route along the Ohio and the Mississippi River that ran from north to south down into New Orleans. And they would take before they had the steamboats, they would take the flatboats and they would float the bourbon down the river. So he was one of those guys for several years, which I thought was pretty cool. I did not know that about Lincoln. I was like, oh, it's actually really neat. So he actually spent a few years doing that, from about like 1828 to 1830. So he spent a few summers floating down the river, which is, I'm sure, also I'm sure that also teaches you a lot about who you are, and a lot about the country too, as you're traveling up and down the river and meeting different people. Um, so I thought that was pretty interesting that he didn't just stay in one place. I mean, he was kind of, I mean, between moving and then the jobs that he took on as a young adult, Lincoln kind of got to see a good portion of the U.S.
Yeah, that definitely seems like that's the case. I mean, because he started out in Kentucky, ended up in Illinois, but then later on in his political career, he did a lot of writing around to meet all of his clients. So it seems like he is very in touch with the countryside, and then also floating down to New Orleans, like the different cultural shifts from the north and the south, and all that kind of involved that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it probably played a big role in his like forming, in his values and his beliefs. Um, and I wonder too if it formed this idea of a country, a nation that was unified, and a people that was unified. And I wonder if maybe that played a little bit of a role in later on in his political career in just making the decisions he made when it came to preserving the union. So I don't know, but I think at the very least, I'm sure it probably gave him a good sense of what it was like outside of Indiana, Illinois.
Yeah, I was probably pretty excited to get on those flatboats and get to a place a little less boring, like we were saying.
Yeah, a sense of adventure.
It's a nice little gap year that he took.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was a cool little gap year. Yeah. But Jake, you also mentioned before the podcast in kind of those early years of life, he was a pretty talented. I don't know how old he was when he wrestled. But you said he was a pretty talented athlete as well.
Yeah,
Not only like he was not only talented when it came to just reading and writing and studying, but he was a pretty talented athlete.
yeah, he was a big time wrestler actually, despite his like lack of physical coordination. Seemingly, if you see pictures, he was a taller, more gangly type of figure. But no, he was actually his official record is 300 wins and 2 losses. So, I mean that really speaks for itself. And something that I found while I was researching is that in 1992 he was officially recognized by the National Wrestling Hall of Fame and awarded the title of Outstanding American in the sport. So yeah, something I did not know about him. But yeah, I think I know he began in high school and then actually practiced it well into his law career. Would
Huh.
enjoy participating in wrestling tournaments and obviously winning the majority of them.
Yeah.
So that was a pretty cool little anecdote about his life that most people don't know about.
Yeah, that's really neat. I didn't know that at all. And I mean, when you first said 300 wins, I was like, 300 wins? Was that like half the population of Indiana at the time? Like, is he just like running around like wrestling like 6-year-olds? Like,
Taking all
yeah,
comers.
yeah, like anybody, come on, come on. He held the Indiana state record. He was like the only person in Indiana history to ever wrestle everybody and win.
that that actually that reminds me of something. There's a quote I found that he was I guess apparently he was like a like NBA level of a trash talker too. There's this one I'm gonna try and pull it up here. Um okay, here it is. I guess after he'd thrown someone in like under a minute, he stood up in the ring, faced the crowd, and said, and I quote, "Any of you who want to try it, come on and wet your horns." So basically, in today's world, that's like I don't know, like come at me or
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, I guess he was known for enjoying getting under the skin of his opponents, which is
That's a
kind of contradicts most perceptions of his character, but
mhm.
I guess I don't know if you must have just been a gamer, gets in the moment and likes to maybe goes out of character a little bit. So, but yeah, it was a pretty interesting fact.
Yeah, I think maybe it sounds like his ambition might have had a lot to do with that. I think he seemed like a pretty ambitious individual. Like, I mean, somebody that's not ambitious doesn't hop on a flatboat and float down a river to go to, New Orleans. Somebody that's not, ambitious or adventurous. I mean, they wouldn't try to just take up law the way he did, like we'll talk about in a little bit. Like, it takes a lot of ambition, and I think a lot of self-confidence too. So I think we like to think of Lincoln as this like kind of like timid, very learned, quiet man that spoke when he needed to speak. And maybe in some cases that was true, but I think he was a pretty like, I mean, if you look at like some of the things he did too during the Civil War, like he was a pretty like confident, aggressive individual, I think. I don't know. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
I think you're right about that. I mean, he seemed like he wasn't afraid of standing his ground, like in his debates, um, or like something that was mentioned a lot in those podcasts we were listening to, was how much people enjoy listening to his stories. I mean, he was well known as one of the greatest storytellers in the state. Um, so he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't party, but he loved to have a good time with conversation. So it seemed like he almost shot for like the hardest types of things to do and mastered them, like wrestling, speaking, thinking, writing. Um, he also was, as a young man, a very proficient fence builder. I think he was considered like one of the best fence builders around. And that's pretty hard work, like they were saying, like it's tall enough that a horse can't jump it, stout enough that a bull can't break through it, and then tight enough that a pig can't squeeze through it. Um, so he would do that and his chores at home, get hired out, and then it looks like he just loved to try out new things in all the different venues.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, what a resume this guy had. Like 301 and a fence builder, like, or the best fence builder around. I mean, like this. I mean that's quite the. Whip out that resume, uh, and I mean, it could land you some interesting jobs. I think, along with his law with his law career. But no, Tom, it's interesting you mentioned the storyteller aspect of Lincoln, like how great of a storyteller he was, because I think it was the video clip I sent you guys with Lex Friedman, and the guy that was talking to Lex Friedman mentioned that one of the reasons Lincoln was the greatest president in American history is because of his ability to inspire the American people to dream of great things, like of what the country could be. And he said, that's kind of the responsibility of a leader, and that's what good leaders do. They help the citizens. They don't tell the citizens what to do. They help the citizens dream of what the country can be, and then try to put that into action to make those dreams become a reality, or something along the lines of that. So I think that's interesting you mentioned that storytelling, because I think like he wasn't, I think as a leader he was trying to bring these ideas of what he not only what he thought the country could be, but also what he thought the American people. He was representing the dreams of the American people and trying to transform America into something that the American people would want to have in the future, I think. Trying to dream the future, dream big. And I think that's something that's maybe very, like I look back at presidents of the past, I think him, out of all people, uh, I think when you look at his writings and his speeches, they do have this very like they all tell a story, and that story is trying to get a point across. Whether you look at the Gettysburg Address or the Emancipation Proclamation, any of these major things that major speeches that or proclamations that he wrote during his presidency. I mean, they all tell a really big story, and I think he was trying to get the American people inspired through that story. So that's pretty interesting that you brought that up, because I was kind of thinking about that as I was doing research and and reading different things that he had written.
Yeah, it's interesting how he wanted to become the master of the English language, even though he didn't really receive much of a formal education. It's a testament, I think, to the power of self-determination and wanting to excel at something. And so if he lived that experience in his life from all the different things he did and then applied himself to the extent that he did, then he's in a way an ambassador for the American dream, because he can show people. I think I heard this in a podcast that he wanted to show America that a little boy born in nowhere, who was just raised on a farm without much education, can become the president. So it allows and shows the rest of America that anything is possible in the land of opportunity.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's like that. I think that's a very unique perspective. Um, and I think it's a very genuine perspective. Like when you look at a lot of leaders, I don't think a lot of leaders bring that into their office. Like they lose that. Maybe that's the original intention for them getting into politics or them getting into um, whatever they're getting into, but then they lose that along the way. They lose that, like, why am I doing this? But I think that's maybe what's unique about Lincoln. He kept that all the way to the end. Like he really stuck with that why, I think. Like that, why am I here? Why am I doing this? What job am I here to do? How can I inspire the American people?
Yeah, like he didn't let his ego get in the way of the job that he had to do. Um, and I know that they mentioned on that podcast that he had during his speeches always kept a sort of like self-deprecating manner he liked to joke about, um, like his lack of education or even his outward appearance. So he always, I guess, kept it very, very down to earth. And I think that's a big reason why so many people were drawn to him as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it says a lot about a person when you can kind of have that self-deprecating humor. I mean, you look at the politicians nowadays, and they're also like like it's just so stuffy. Like
Yeah,
they can't make a joke about themselves. It just seems so disingenuous.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
there's something about that like I think really captivates you as a listener, you as a like, I think it just captivates you when you see something. They're like, oh, this is a cool guy. This guy's cool. This guy's down to earth. This guy isn't just another politician.
Because at the end of the day, nobody really wants to listen to somebody rattling off all of their achievements, especially if
Exactly.
they're not planning on following through with their actions. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, yeah, it doesn't, the achievements, yeah, the achievements can be important sometimes, but most of the time it's how well can you relate to the people you're trying to speak to or inspire? And I think he did. I think, he had the achievements to back it up, but I mean, he was, I think, just a really relatable person to a lot of people. I think that's what made him a good president. Um, so in 1830, Lincoln moved again. This time, um, he moved to Illinois. So this is finally when Illinois gets to take a little bit of credit here, but not too much because I mean, at this point he's in his 20s, so there was like little there was no early childhood shaping there. Indiana can take the credit for that. So he moved with his family to Illinois, settling in Macon County, Illinois. He worked the flatboats um, in for the first like year in Illinois, and then he quit his job as a flatboat man and became a clerk at in New Salem, Illinois, at the general store. And then he was kind of like he's kind of like this guy was like a Renaissance man. This man did like a little bit of everything. He was a flatboat worker. Then he worked as the clerk at the general store. Then he was a shopkeeper. Then he worked as a surveyor. Then he was like appointed like I forget what it was. He was appointed something for like the local militia. Then he was like a postmaster. He like tried a little bit of everything. So like from like 1830 to 1836, he was all over the place. He was like he had like a new job every 6 months. He was like your typical millennial trying to job skip to get the pay bump. Like I don't know what he was up to. It was funny. I was like reading. I was looking at the timeline. I was like, well, he just changed a job like 6 months ago. What is he doing? I felt like an HR person reading a resume. Like, what the heck was he doing for the last 4 years? Um, but yeah, no, it's funny. Like he was all over the place. So he really, I feel like, was like kind of this Renaissance man. Like he was all over the place. Like he was a wrestler, he was a fence builder, he was a shopkeeper, he was a surveyor, he was a postmaster, he was running up and down a river with bourbon. I mean, he was he was all over the place. And then he finally decided in 1834 to start studying law. And like, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but like personally, like in my 20s at this point, I mean, he's into his 20s. Like, I wouldn't think to just pick up law and start studying it on my own. So I thought that was pretty crazy. So he starts studying law, um, and up until this point, I mean, Lincoln was mostly self-educated, like we said. So he picks up studying law. Um, and this is kind of the moment where there's a shift, I think, in Lincoln's direction, because it's as he begins to study law, I think that it really projects him in down the path of a political kind of a political career. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But yeah, guys, what do you like? What are your thoughts on this? 'Cause, like, I'm kind of, it was like baffling. Like he's job hopping, and then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, I'm going to study law."
Yeah, it's a massive shift. Like there's no overlap or correlation between what he was doing before and then in a career in law. So that was but I guess maybe all that maybe he had it in mind all along, and that was just those jobs were just a bridge as he taught himself and acquired more skills that were needed to achieve success in a career in law. Maybe that was his plan all along. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting because they mentioned in that other podcast that back in that day, if you studied law, then I think there was another lawyer who would go to them, would ask you some questions, depending on how well you answered, they would kind of give you the thumbs up, and then if you got referred to or by someone who the community respected, they would vouch for your character, and then you become a lawyer. It almost seems a lot better than now. Like, now you have to go to school, pay a king's ransom to be there, and then you're not really judged at all by your character. It's just like if you can pass this exam, and then you get to become a lawyer. But it's pretty interesting how he decided to apply himself in that way. Um, Maybe it's because he liked to. I don't know. Maybe you guys could say what you think on this, but it seems like Lincoln was very observant of people, and so maybe the lawyer way thing was a way for him to be more associated with his community.
I think you're onto something there because I think in Lincoln's mind, I think law was a way to, and if you look at even his law career, I mean, I didn't get too into this in my research, but he was pretty successful in law, and he spent a lot of time um, practicing before he became president. But I mean, I think he wanted to represent his fellow citizen. And I think he really loved doing that. So I think this gave him the opportunity to represent the American citizen, his fellow citizens, rights and needs in a greater way. And I think that's maybe that like desire to serve on a higher level was maybe one of the things that pushed him towards law. So I think maybe you're onto something there with that level of interaction with people. I think maybe too it was a certain level or a desire of service.
Yeah, because at least like when he was in the Whig Party, we'll get to this later another time, but he had mentioned that he was in politics for a while, but then he was kind of, I guess, I don't know, it kind of wore on him a bit, so he decided to go back to just his lawyer, um, his life as a lawyer. But it was when the the Missouri law that would have kept slavery at a certain point from expanding west was overturned when he really wanted to get back in and help stop that. Which is really interesting. You can see that he didn't want slaves to be around in America. He wanted them to be free. Um, so I thought that spoke pretty well of what his intentions were in politics since he decided to go back into that arena after he had left previously.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I thought that was really interesting too, because so he got started. I think shortly after he started studying law, he was elected as a Whig candidate for the county, um, and then he became licensed to practice law, and then moved to Springfield, Illinois, which is where he's buried and where his grave is today. And he became a law partner with John T. Stewart, and then he kind of, when he was in Springfield, got more involved in the politics, and then actually served a short time in the Whig Party as a representative in the United States House of Representatives, and then he kind of like there was like a short hiatus where he was kind of gone from um, the political view. He just kind of disappeared. But then, yeah, like you mentioned, Tom, the passage, I think it was the Kansas Nebraska Act, which allowed slavery to expand beyond the boundaries set in the Missouri Compromise. And this was the thing that we had talked about a little bit in the Foundations of Freedom series that we did on the Civil War. This, this Kansas Nebraska Act, I think, really got him fired up to get back into politics. And that was in May of 1854. So, shortly thereafter, and I think he served at the House of Representatives in 49, from 47 to 49. And then he kind of disappeared for like 5 years. And then in 54, that happens. And then I think it sparked something in him. And I think it really got him fired up to come back and represent his fellow Americans.
Yeah, like he became one of their spokesmen essentially of trying to push back this thing that had been stopped, but now it's moving forward again. And wasn't it at that time that the Whig Party started to fade, and that's when the Republican Party got rolling? And then a lot of the old Whigs and what they said, like Democrats that weren't too heavily in the party, who weren't too satisfied, started to move over to the Republican Party. And then very quickly, Lincoln became well known in that party, and there's a high influence in it.
Yeah, from like when he got back into politics, like almost instantly the Whig Party died off, and then he was like going to the Republican conventions and committees and speaking and advocating for like 4 years. That's like what he did. So that was, and during that time too, he was practicing law. So that was something that he like continued to do throughout he wasn't just in politics. He was also still the lawyer, which was kind of interesting. Um, but then in 1858, and this is kind of the famous, um, like one of his more famous debates, he engaged in a series of debates with Stephen A. Douglas, who is the Democratic candidate for the United States Senate. So then the Lincoln Douglas debates and the publication of that text really increased Lincoln's notoriety in the public's eye. And I think that's what ultimately got him um, the bid to run for U.S. president. But those Lincoln Douglas debates, I mean, like there was some pretty interesting stuff that happened during that. Some pretty interesting debates that happened in like I think it was like a few month time span. It was pretty intense.
Yeah, it was like those two masters of rhetoric going up against each other. So it would have been, yeah, it's one of those things you give anything to be a fly on the wall listening to those two going at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'll link. There's a the Library of Congress has a lot of the original like papers, the correspondence between Lincoln and Douglas. So there's like that original text that was used for the publications. So I'll link that in the podcast show notes. But it's kind of interesting to do a little bit of research to read some of those debates. Um, but yeah, I think it was a different time you don't see those types of debates being had in the current political sphere. It was a it was I think a much better time as far as the sharing of ideas went in politics. When you look at the quality, the level of dialogue between a Republican and a Democrat and the ideas they were sharing back and forth, you're like, oh, now we just get up there and scream at each other about nonsense like climate change. like it, like they had really important, really meaningful conversation, like very meaningful debate. I feel like as opposed to just kind of the run of the mill BS that you hear in the presidential debates, or even just general debating on either side nowadays.
Yeah, it's like they're actually expressing their ideas, not just fixated on tearing the opposition down. Like if you look at the transcripts of those Lincoln Douglas debates, they actually speak pretty minimally directly to regarding each other. It's really just yeah, like them articulating their beliefs and standpoints.
Yeah, I think they let the ideas speak for themselves. Like there was no need to sit and bash and discredit another person's, whether it was their ideas or just their, them as a person. Like there was no need for that. Like I think there was this sense that the better idea would win. And that's not something that like it I don't think that's something that's in politics today. It's all about what sells, what's pretty, and how can we make the other side look like fools. And so it's something completely different. So it was really interesting to kind of look at that, because I think the dialogue there is something that I would like to see be brought back in modern politics. I think it'd be really cool to see something like that. Um, but moving on, after the Lincoln Douglas debates, Lincoln runs for U.S. Senate, and he loses the race in Illinois. So, even with that notoriety, Lincoln loses. But then, so that's October, late, like 1858. And then in 1860, um, Lincoln is nominated he runs for the Republican Party. He's nominated as the Republican party's candidate for the president in the election of 1860. And he is elected president of the United States later that year in November. And that's kind of where the shit hits the fan, so to speak. Everything kind of falls apart after that. Because a month later, in December of that year, South Carolina is the first state to secede the Union. So I think we're going to end it there today. And we're going to pick it back up in part 2 of the Foundations of Freedom Lincoln series. We'll start with his presidency, the turmoil in his first days as a president, his first 16 days as a president, his early assassination attempt, the one that a lot of people don't know about, or the early assassination plot. And then we'll talk about the Civil War, the things that he did during the war, not only to preserve the Union, but to make America a more free and better place by freeing the slaves. And then we'll also talk about his death. So we'll do that in part 2 of the Foundations of Freedom series. Thanks everybody for tuning in to this podcast. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it's going to be a fun one too next week. I'm looking forward to it. Guys, is there anything else we forgot to cover before we close out for the evening?
I think that was all I had.
Well, I think we'll be releasing it this week, but we have a pretty exciting thing we're doing for Memorial Day.
Yes. I will talk a little bit about that. Yes. Good thinking, Tom. It was on my list of things to do. So yes, before we close out for the night, I do want to talk about this because it's pretty cool. So we've hinted at this in previous podcasts, but on Memorial Day, we will be doing a campaign to raise money and awareness for veterans. It's called 22 Veterans. We will be it'll be multifaceted. We'll be running. Well, we won't be running. We'll be walking 22 miles. Me and Tom will, and whoever wants to join us can join us. We'll be walking 22 miles as a way to raise awareness and remember the 22 veterans that commit suicide every day. And that number's gone down a little bit since the original number of 22 came out a few years ago, but it's still very high. So we want to really bring that to the forefront of people's minds this Memorial Day as we're remembering those who have served our country. And in order to help support veterans and their families, we will be dropping apparel release. So we'll have t-shirts and hats. All proceeds from the sales of those t-shirts and hats will go towards supporting veterans and their families through an organization called Mission 22, which is dedicated to putting on programs and giving support to veterans and their families. And then we'll also be raising money through our page as well. If you just want to donate or sponsor me and Tom, one of me and Tom's miles, you can sponsor one of our miles by donating on our website, and all the proceeds from that will go directly over to Mission 22. So we're really looking forward to that. We'll be posting some more information up on our social media pages this week. But if you're listening to this, you get the early bird the early bird experience here. So you can go check that out. Go to our website, lifelineusa.store/mission22. I believe that's it, right, Tom? We'll post it. We'll post it in the show notes. I'm pretty sure that's it, but I don't want to give you guys the wrong one. But it's going to be in the show notes. Like I said, you can do a bunch of different things to get involved. You can sponsor one of our miles, buy a t-shirt, and if you want to get involved in the challenge, if you want to walk 22 miles, that's amazing. If you can't do the 22 miles, you can do 22 push-ups, and then tag us on Instagram, True Social, Twitter, and just put, hashtag 22 veterans, hashtag 22 push-ups, put those out there, and then try to, post a picture of yourself and challenge others to do it as well. We're just going to try to raise as much money and awareness for our veterans as we can this Memorial Day. So really looking forward to that.
I think that's it for me.
Awesome. Well, guys and gals who are listening, thanks so much for tuning in this week. Hopefully you enjoyed this podcast. If you want to go check us out, if this is your first time listening to the show, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, the Green Dragon Podcast. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter. So we're out there as well. We post every Friday a new podcast, so you can listen to it on your way to work. We post them at 6 a.m. Eastern time. So look out for a new podcast every week. Until next week, be safe Be vigilant, be a good neighbor, but most importantly, be a good American. God bless.